Digital Tears Fell from Her Virtual Eyes, or The Ethics of Virtual Beings, written by me, Michael LaBossiere. Originally published in Experience Machines, an anthology published by Rowman and Littlefield International in 2017. This particular volume was commissioned to have philosophers write about Robert Nozick's famous Experience Machine. And Nozick's a famous philosopher, but of course being famous in philosophy is rather like being famous at curling, that sport in which one throws a stone across the ice, and then people sweep in front of it, I guess, to see how far or fast it can go. And there are people in the world who have gold medals in this sport, but I have no idea who they are, just like most people have no idea who the gold medalists, so to speak, in philosophy are. So, what is this experience machine? Well, Nozick asks us to imagine essentially a virtual reality. He didn't invent this notion, but he created this particular big thought experiment. And so, in this machine, you could have any pleasurable experience you wanted. Essentially a very pleasant reality. Fake, of course. Now, Nozick's point of creating this was to essentially argue against what's called philosophical ethical hedonism. The idea that what is good is pleasure, maximizing pleasure. And this is put forth by thinkers like, most famously, John Stuart Mill. So, his argument is essentially this. If all that matters is maximizing pleasure, then whatever you do that would give you more pleasure would be good. Now, if we plug into this virtual experience machine, then that would create the most pleasure, better than if we did not plug into these machines. And his view is, of course, that this is wrong, because we have good reasons not to go into this machine, because some of the reasons he gives is that we want to do certain things and not just have the experience. We also, he claims, want to be a certain sort of person, and we can't be that in the machine. And of course, it provides us with, a limitation. We're engaged in an artificial reality as opposed to the real reality. So that is essentially the experience machine. Think of it as a virtuality, and the main argument is, create the greatest pleasure for us, but it's essentially not real, and that's why it's bad. So, getting into by the essay, the article I wrote in this work, essentially begin by saying that his experience machine makes three critical assumptions. First is metaphysical. It only works if there is a real world distinct from the virtual world of the machine. Secondly is epistemic, that a person can know the difference between the real and the virtual. The third is the moral aspect, that the beings of this virtual world lack moral status, or have a moral status far below beings in the real world. And of course that would be critical to his view, because again, the idea is that if you're in an experience machine doing stuff, you're not really doing anything. What you have has no real value. Even if you have great enjoyment from what you're doing, it is valueless. So the goal of this work is to examine these three assumptions and show that experiences in a suitably constructed virtual world would have value, and that the inhabitants of this world either have or should be presumed to have moral status, essentially arguing contrary to Nozick that virtual beings can have worth, can have moral value. Now, to do this, I will do something may seem kind of odd. I'll begin with dog meat. Not literal dog meat, but there's a famous NPC, non-player character, in the game series Fallout, going back to the beginning. And it's a dog named Dogmeat. And you can rescue Dogmeat, and he can become one of your NPCs. He's based on Mad Max's dog in the original Mad Max movie. the original going quite a ways back. So there's an assumption, of course, that virtual beings lack status. But in this game, Fallout, people tend to exhibit considerable concern for the NPC dog meat. They exhibit both psychological concern and moral concern. So how can we give this virtual dog this seeming moral status? So what I'm going to do, or rather what I did since it was written quite a while ago, is I took Kant's animal argument and repurposed it using what I call the principle of analogous service. So in the video game Fallout, dog meat is a virtual animal. Now for Kant, our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, and his ethics, he takes moral status to be grounded on rationality. So only rational beings like you and I have moral worth. And animals for him lack rationality. So they are effectively objects. Because in Kant's metaphysical moral universe, you're either a rational being and you have worth, or the other things would be objects that have no rationality and have no worth. And this would include both what we think of as normally as objects, like tables and chairs, but also animals as well, no matter how complicated they are, as long as they lack rationality. Now in the game, dog meat is a program object, to use some programmer talk. And for Kant, he calls animals objects of the inclination. That doesn't mean that we in terms of people like animals, which they do, he means that when he talks about objects of the inclination, is that their value or worth depends on our inclinations towards them. So for Kant, your laptop would have no moral status, but it would gain some value because you value it, and it would be an object of your inclination. Now Kant contends that we rational beings have no direct moral obligations to animals, because we can't have obligations to objects. You have no obligation to your laptop or a rock. Animals are effectively in the same category as rocks, so we have no direct obligations to them. So how does he work in, animals having seeming status? Well, he does a bit of sleight of hand. And this is how it works. If an action by a rational being, you or I, would create a moral obligation in another rational being, then an analogous action by an animal would create what he calls an indirect moral obligation. One could use the example of indirect friends in a way, that if you're friends with somebody and you know somebody else is a friend of your friend, even though you're not friends directly with them, you'd probably be positively inclined towards them, unless of course you heard bad stuff about them. So this principle of analogous service works like this. It gives an ersatz, not really fake, but not real either, moral obligation. And this would be created if the service provided by a non-rational being to a rational being is analogous to what would create a real moral obligation to a rational being that performed that service. So, for example, to give a concrete example, if there was someone who protected you and took care of you throughout your life, and then they grew old, you would seem to have an obligation to them for all they've done for you, if they're a human being. And so, likewise, if you had a dog that protected you and took care of you, and then grew old, even though for Kant the dog has no moral status of its own, you would have this ersatz obligation. It would be as if you were obligated to the dog, even though for Kant you can't have real obligations to the dog, or so he claims. So, to repurpose this Kantian animal argument, can you use the principle of emotional impact? So how do animals get this ersatz, this fake but not totally phony moral status? Well, the way Kant does it again is psychological, and I'll steal from him, that I do it the same way. It's grounded in the psychological consequences of their treatment. So, treating animals badly, following Kant here, would have harmful consequences for rational beings. I'll use an analogy to CPR training. So, if you've ever done CPR training, you typically work on a CPR dummy. It's just, this thing. And they come in varying degrees of complexity, but it still is just an object. So no matter what you do to it, you can't hurt it or kill it. Now, if someone screws around in CPR training where they're supposed to be learning how to do it, and they just screw around and do it badly, it's not going to hurt the CPR dummy because they're just an object. But if they go and they have to do CPR on a human being, they're probably going to screw it up and not succeed. So, by analogy, if people are, mean and cruel to animals, then it would be like screwing around with the CPR dummy. Person's, going to learn bad things, and they're going to be mean in the case of being bad to animals. They'd also be bad to humans. And if we're kind to animals, it'd be like taking the CPR training seriously, even though it's just an object. You'd become hopefully good at CPR and be ready to perform it on a human. Likewise, if we're kind to animals, it'll affect our character. So it would make us likely to be kind to humans. And so essentially for Kant, it's based on how we treat animals affects our character, and that gives us these indirect obligations. So we owe nothing to dogs, but if we're bad to dogs, we're bad to people, and we have obligations to people, so we have indirect obligations to dogs. Just like when you're doing, again, going back to the CPR analogy, when you're doing CPR training, you have no obligation to the CPR dummy because it's just plastic. But you have obligations to people, so you have to do the CPR properly in the practice so that when you're doing CPR on humans, you can get it right. So how does this apply to dog meat? Well, obviously the video game, NPC character, dog meat, lacks moral status because he doesn't have any qualities that could give him this status. And so in Kantian moral metaphysics, he's on par with animals. He's he's an object, they're objects. So by parity of reasoning, that parity, as opposed to parody, parity of reasoning, again, is that if you have reasoning that is, good, and you have similar reasoning that's analogous, it's also good. And you can also take essentially it's a fancy way of saying, I'm using an argument by analogy, comparing these two arguments. But it sounds, a bit more, prestigious, I suppose. So by this parity of reasoning, dog meat and other virtual beings should also have this ersatz status. Again, they don't have status of their own, but it's as if they have status. And again, not like fake, but not quite real. Now there's kind of an obvious objection here, which is this. Sticks and stones are also objects, but no one would think that there are any ersatz moral obligations to them. If someone was out throwing, rocks into a river, it would be weird to say to them, be nice to those rocks or you'll be bad to people. That would be weird. Or if someone was putting sticks in a fire, someone saying, oh my gosh, what are you doing? If you burn those sticks, you'll probably, become an arsonist. Well, so the objection essentially is they're objects like sticks and stones, but they have no status. So virtual beings like dog meat should be denied even in this ersatz moral status. So obviously, since I'm raising the objection, I have a way to respond to it. And the way to respond to it is try to show that virtual beings are more like dogs than they are like sticks. So first reply to this, what I call the object objection. The principle of service. So a virtual being in our experience machine, our virtual reality, could engage in virtual behavior analogous to what would warrant an obligation if done by a human in the actual world. For example, if you ever played Fallout, or if you played similar video games, or any video games that allow you to have non-player character companions, your non-player character companions, typically, help you out with varying degrees of success and annoyance. And so, in the game Fallout, Dogmeat can accompany you around, he can attack your enemies and warn you of danger, or just, kind of hang out with you. So he can, virtually in the game, he can help you and assist you the way that a real player would. And in many cases, maybe better than a real player, because at least he won't, shout horrible things at you in chat. So in terms of, actual behavior, the NPCs tend to be better than real people. Well, if you've ever done online gaming, you know of which I speak. If you've not, better not to do that. Now, sticks and stones, be they virtual or real, can't do this. Now, an obvious objection to my reply to my objection, I think it's kind of, like Inception here, an objection within a reply to an objection, etc. But here's the objection to my reply, that the virtual being does not earn its status. It does not choose its actions, and just does what it's programmed to do. So if Dogmeat is protecting you in the game, he's not bravely choosing to protect you, he's just code. He's just doing what the code says to do. Replying, well, Kant's argument doesn't require that the being earn this status through choice. There's nothing in his work that says the being has to make this choice. In fact, given Kant's view, these objects, these animals, don't make choices. They're not rational. So all it needs to do is to act analogously similar to beings that do choose. That's to say, the programmed object of Dogmeat just needs to act the way that a human player in the game would act. Better, probably. So, for Kant, animals can't choose. They act from their biological programming, and that, of course, strengthens the analogy. For Kant, animals are programmed to do what they do, and Dogmeat in the video game is also programmed to do what Dogmeat does. And so that seems to solve the problem. In response to the object objection, the virtual dog is more complicated than a stick and a stone. It can do stuff in the game. In terms of not earning it, well, Kant has no requirement that something earns it in the sense of choosing. It just has to do the actions. Second reply to the object objection, the principle of emotional impact. So the most important concern about the treatment of non-rational beings is how it impacts the people engaging in such behavior. And I'll use an example involving ISIS, not the terrorist group, but my husky, Isis. She's no longer with me, but I still have many fond memories of her, and that's a picture of her, with her one brown eye and one blue eye. So, what matters, of course, in the case of Isis is, again, my husky, is not that, that she was rational, although I believe she was. It's the emotional effect. So being kind to Isis has emotional impact on me. Similarly, in the video game Dogmeat, it's like having you're having a virtual dog, and it can affect you, emotionally. It affects your behavior. If you're kind to your dog, the reasoning is your real dog, in my case, my husky, or your virtual dog, Dogmeat, you'll become a better person. And if someone is cruel to their dog or virtual dog, they'll become worse. So what is needed, of course, is an argument to show that virtual beings can have this emotional impact, can affect us emotionally. I would think that anyone who's not soulless, I'm a bit biased here, would believe that dogs and other animals have emotional consequences for us. How we treat them affects who we are. And so next, we'll take a look at the emotional impact of virtual beings.